There is a calm here that feels deliberate, measured like a metronome set to a lullaby. Stars, distant and patient, pinprick the dark with cold light. Their fires are small lamps along a corridor of endless night. Between them is an ocean, black and deep, and it moves not with waves but with silence. It carries no tide, only weight, the slow, inevitable gravity of things that are tired. Listen. Do you hear it? Just beneath the hiss of a dying sun, under the faint crackle of a long-abandoned calm, there is a hum, a note so low it slips past words. It is the voice of distance. It is the voice of things breathing in the dark. The galaxy seems, at first, to be a collection of isolated sighs. A world spins and cools. Another blinks its final aurora and goes dark. A lone scout ship, lanterns dimmed and hull scored by micrometeors, drifts like flotsam. The sensors aboard that scout register nothing remarkable. Their logs fill with routine checks, then with fragments. A patch of static at 0.3 Hz, a fluctuation in background radiation, an unaccountable lull in the star chart. Such things are cataloged, filed, then buried beneath newer alarms. Life continues. Machines continue. Men continue. Even gods, if gods are still counted, keep to their rituals. It is comforting the way everything keeps its place. There is order in the small things. The turn of a turbine, the recorded breath of a sleeper in cryostasis, the reverent whisper of a chapel priest as he tends a dying light. These micro-rituals knit the galaxy together, a fragile tapestry held by threadbare belief. They make the vastness manageable, but the space between the threads is not empty. If you could follow the silence like a river, you would trace its course through empty sectors and between ruined stations. Past derelict hulls hung like carcasses on the slow current, you would find the remains of fleets, scattered, ancient, their identification sigils sealed by rust and ceremony. You would pass planets that no longer remember their names, their continents mapped by scars, their skies thick with dust that never meets a breeze. You would hear in the distance of this silence the last, thin signals of worlds that used to sing. Those signals fade. They fray into static, then into nothing at all. Imagine the sound of 1,000 voices turned down, one by one, until there is only the memory of their cadence. That memory gathers like dew on cold metal. It clings, it hums. It is in that hum that the void keeps its counsel. The void is patient. It holds its breath and waits, and the waiting is a kind of music. It is not an empty waiting, as if someone might arrive with a knock and be welcomed in. No, it is a waiting saturated with intent, slow and immense, more like the hush in a temple before some unseen rite begins. There is purpose in its pause, but the purpose is not ours to name. Wanderers, pilots who have crossed too many dark systems, astropaths who have listened too long to the dead, speak of the dreaming void. They do not always say it aloud. They do not like to put the image into language. But when sleep takes them in cramped bunks, and the hum of their own implants is the only company, their dreams carry the same shape. Vast spaces that fold inward like the gullet of a sleeping thing. Faint lights moving like fish under black water. The sense that something sleeps with its mouth half open and breathes. There is a cadence to that breath. Long as a season, low as a drum at the bottom of a well. When the breath draws in, currents along the spine of a dying star shiver. Dust-laden atmospheres ripple like cloth. When it exhales, signals that have been traveling for centuries falter and lose their way, falling silent as if someone has closed a hand over a mouth. It is a comforting image at first, the idea of sleep given a cosmic scale. Sleep implies rest. Rest suggests reprieve. It makes the terrible familiar. Creatures who sleep will eventually wake, but they will also slumber again. Sleep creates pattern. Pattern creates comfort. Yet the dream is not empty. Under the slow swell of that breathing, something listens. You could say that the void itself is listening, that the gaps between stars are attentive to the tiny dramas unfolding on beleaguered worlds. But there is more than metaphoric attention. There is a quality to this listening that tastes of appetite, an awareness keyed to the faintest movement, to the echo of a hammer blow in a deserted foundry, to the tiny pulse of a newborn's heartbeat transmitted by an old distress beacon. The void's listening is not a casual curiosity. It catalogs. It remembers. Consider the derelict scout again. Its log registers one last thing before the comms go dark. A whisper, almost too low for the audio filters to pick up, caught for one frame and then gone. The entry is annotated by the officer on duty, who blames interference and moves on. Later, the officer will lie awake and recall nothing of consequence beyond that notation. Later still, when he is older and his hair is thin, and his memory begins to betray him, that notation will look like a punctuation mark of fate. He will not have the words to describe it. He will only feel, like a taste at the back of the tongue, that the universe paused to listen and then turned its face inward again. There is a particular quality to the emptiness that makes it feel like an ocean. It is not an ocean of water, but an ocean of absence, its waves made of lack. The current moves slowly, but it moves. Debris collects along eddies of gravity. Comets trace long fingerprints across the darkness. At the edges of this ocean, stars throw off light that spills like phosphorescence across black seas. Yet even that light seems respectful, as if it avoids disturbing something sleeping beneath. Imagine standing at the prow of a ship, your palms cold against railing, the void before you like a smooth black glass. The only sounds are the creaking of metal, your respirator, and the distant channel of the ship's core. Your instruments pick up nothing more than background radiation. You feel small in this way that is both terrifying and soothing. Out here, all the petty cruelties of war and politics feel further away than the nearest moon. You could breathe easy. You could pretend you are safe. But beneath the hull, beneath the thrumming reactors and the carefully maintained life support, something listens. It is methodical, not malevolent in the childish sense, but absolute in its focus. It gathers the fading songs of worlds like shells on a beach. It learns them. It remembers the cadences, the timbres, the things that make a species sing. It keeps these songs in a place where hunger might someday wake and want to taste them. You do not notice at first that the void remembers so many things. It remembers the names of dead constellations. It remembers the scent of rain on a world that still calls itself a world. It remembers the texture of old machines and the precise pitch of a child's laugh recorded once by a transmission buoy. Memory here is not a human memory, flawed, colored, and noisy, but a slow, crystalline archive, pristine in its amassing. It stacks the artifacts of life in layers as a coral grows, minute upon minute, until the heap itself is heavy enough to be called a thing. There is a particular melancholy to this collection. It is like walking through a museum of the lost, halls where the exhibits are not objects but moments, frozen instances of human experience preserved in static. You press your hand to one of the displays and hear, for a page-turning second, the scrape of a spoon against a bowl, a child coughing, a hymn hummed under breath. Then the recording ends, and you are alone again with the slow hum. The void's archive is not indifferent, but it is not sentimental either. It treats the preserved sounds with clinical appreciation. It catalogs not to honor but to prepare. The difference is subtle, and perhaps it is only visible in the way the humidity of a recorded breath seems to turn to data, thin, efficient, consumable. The tragedies of centuries are reduced to coordinates and density readings. Love becomes caloric value. Memory becomes menu. Do not let this thought alarm you yet. There is a fine line between imagining an ocean with teeth and simply appreciating the strange patience of the dark. The mind is quick to embellish. Stories told in bars and on cold decks by drinkers with sharp eyes often become grander with each telling. The empire that once cataloged star systems is good at myth-making. It is also good at ignoring the soft, persistent noises at the periphery of its charts. Yet the noise is there. It is a low, patient susurrus that grows when the void's own breathing deepens. The whir of dying machinery on an abandoned station seems louder then, like the last thing a clock says before it stops. The rustle of thinned atmosphere over a frozen bay on some forgotten moon seems like applause at the edge of a dream. Sailors of many sorts have names for that sound. Some call it the gray song, others call it the underhum. Those who speak of it in hushed tones admit, finally, that it sounds like something thinking very slowly and about very old things. The thought is not a plan, not exactly. It is more like a watchman awake in the night, tracing the horizon again and again, listening for a step that will never arrive until it finally does. There are places where the ocean of nothing swells into something closer to a presence. Fields of debris gather until the void seems to have shape, arms of broken cruisers, rings of a shattered world that keeps circling as if acknowledging a wound. In these places, the archive whispers louder. The preserved signals are thicker here, like the sediment of a riverbed. The noise is legible, patterns repeat. A particular frequency appears often. A low, three-note motif that recurs in distress beacons and funeral dirges, in the creak of hull joints, and in the cadence of prayers. It is as if the galaxy has its own dialect, a secret tongue that the void knows intimately. And what listens to that dialect listens also to what lies between the lines. It hears the pauses, the abandoned drumbeats, the hesitation in a child's cry when the lights went out. Those pauses are important. They are the places where hunger takes its measure. For now, though, hunger is a faint thing. It is not a roaring appetite but a pulse, patient and vast. It breathes in the dark and dreams the slow dreams of something immense and older than convenience. It dreams of the taste of a world like one remembers the warmth of a past hand, dim and suffused with longing. There will be time later in the telling to describe how the dream contorts and grows teeth. For now, in this quiet opening, the void invites you to lean into its rhythm. Let your shoulders drop. Let your mind unfurl like a sail in gentle wind. Hear the soft machinery of galaxies turning. Picture the star fields like scuffed coin across a table. Imagine the small, human sounds cataloged and stored like shells in a pocket, each a treasure and a measurement. There is a comfort in that image, that somewhere in the dark between the stars, somebody is listening to your world and keeping its shape. The comfort is thin and fragile, but it is real. And yet the manner of that care is not like human care. It is thorough, clinical, inevitable. It is a kind of attention that will not be soothed by supplication. So we sit with the hush. We let the universe breathe around us. We list the small sounds that make up the days of the forgotten. The hiss of a cooling reactor, the soft clack of a mechanic's tool, the staccato babble of a child in a station nursery. We record them in our minds like prayers. We tuck them into pockets of memory. And as we do, hear this little truth. In the silence between heartbeats of the galaxy, something listens. There are things that keep their histories like book lovers keep shelves, neat rows, spines aligned, labels stamped and cross-referenced. Then there are things that remember like reefs remember the sea, accreting, spiraling, alive with the quiet growth of innumerable small parts. The Tyranid hive is the latter. It remembers by growing. Listen to the voice of that remembering, and it sounds nothing like the proud annals of man. It has no archivist in a brass uniform, no handwritten ledgers, no reverent clerks. Its archive is tissue and enzyme, a tangling of synaptic threads and bioluminescent nodes that pulse slow as tides. It is an anatomy of recollection, each memory a cell folded into the whole until the whole knows itself. They have come in cycles that are older than empires, and older than the myths that rise and fall beneath their wakes. The hive has known winters of void and summers of consumption. It has drifted like a sleeping leviathan between arms of the galaxy, and in its sleep it has taken. It has tasted continents and the blood of oceans. It has learned the texture of feather and the salt of mammalian sweat. It has recorded the pattern of song and the cadence of prayer. Each world devoured becomes a deposited layer in the living archive. What is taken is not just flesh and ship and stone. What is taken is pattern. The hive eats forms and folds them into its mind. Call it what your dialect will. The hive mind, the synaptic sea, the gullet god. Names are small things and they fail when aimed at the vast. The nearest human image to look at is that of a god without form, an intelligence spread like a fungus through the tissue of its swarm, aware not in an ego's linear sentences, but in a chorus's overlapping notes. It dreams in a sea of flesh. The dream has the quality of being both intimate and absolute. It contains not a single thought but a layering of countless impulses, each tiny and urgent, all blending into a slow, mammoth cognition. Its structure is not architecture so much as ecology. Begin at a node, a synaptic gland within a gargantuan biochip, a nexus where nerve-like filaments split and braid, where neurotransmitters flow like sap through an organic lattice. From this node, tendrils reach outward, thin, electric, hungry, connecting with other nodes across the hive fleet like ley lines of living thought. These lines are not stable. They throb and rearrange, closing and opening as need demands. In one instant, a region may be a chorus of tiny hunting instinct. In the next, it may be a unified command, a great, single vector of purpose. The hive's mind is layered. Local clusters sustain reflex and pattern recognition. Mid-level strata combine tactics and metabolism. And the highest strata, if that term can be applied to such a thing, glue everything into motive. It is in those upper strata that memory is not merely stored but felt, in waves of mood and hunger that sweep back down to the hunting teeth below. Imagine a map of consciousness where billions of tiny lights flicker and wink. Each light is a life form or a sensor cell. Each flick is an event encoded and fed into the web. The web is hungry for detail. It learns not by symbols but by sensation. The friction of a planet's atmosphere across a carapace, the particular incidence of radiation from a dying sun, the harmonic of a species' language when it cries fear. These are the units of its record. The catalog grows in textures: taste, pitch, density, cadence. With every feast, the hive's archive thickens. A single devoured species can expand its lattice into 100 new nodes. A world rich with biota multiplies its synaptic complexity. Memory for the hive is accretive. An organism gets fatter with experience. Because memory is flesh here, it has the odors and noises of flesh. Listen closely, and you will hear the slow pulse of organic systems, the measured throb that moves along the great conduits like a heart tide. It is not a mechanical metronome, but an ancient rhythm, uneven with age yet sure. In the deepest corridors of bioships, liquors move, viscous nutrient flow, enzymes dripping in regulated cascades, juices that stomachs send onward through tubes larger than city tunnels. Those drips are a metrical undercurrent beneath the hive's thought. In the silence between each soft splash, the mind arranges 1,000 remembered songs. There are other sounds, too. Beneath the sigh of tide-like recall, there is a distant rumbling, vast digestion engines settling, hydrolytic cauldrons simmering, the slow collapse of organic scaffolds into nutrient pastes. These sounds are grave and extended, not sudden. They have the length of seasons. You could mistake them for geological processes if you did not listen for the small things that sit on top of the rumble. The trill of antennae, the rustle of chitin against chitin, the whisper-speak of minor organisms trading instinctive impulses. These whispers are not made of words, but of modulation, short spikes, damped oscillations, tiny bursts that are the emotional grammar of the swarm. Joy is a quick, sharp flutter, alarm a hard, grinding pulse, hunger a slow, inexorable sigh. To an imperial psyker listening from afar, these whispers would come as a wash of emotion without nouns. Not hunger for bread, but hunger as a texture. Not grief for a fallen comrade, but a wave form that pulls at the edges of others. The hive communicates in feelings stretched thin across distance, in statistical nudges more than orders. When this emotional data concentrates, behaviors cohere. Clusters of organisms form hunting packs, others become brood cultivators. A third set specialize in propulsion. And so, the organic economy of the fleet organizes itself. Memory and action are braided in the same filament. Those memories are not inert. They are living archives that sometimes play back like dreams. Within the body of the hive, scenes repeat, replays of ancestral feasts, impressions of moons tasted long ago. The mind treats the past as training ground and menu. Consider the record of a world called, long ago, by a name that now rolls like a stone. A temperate planet ringed in blue. The hive found it in cycles past and devoured it, and the record of that feast is still vivid in the web. The mind carries the taste of its flora like a pheromone, spicy, acidic, a line of molecules that triggers an anatomical response in present larvae. When larvae sense that old taste, they grow teeth attuned to it. Later, when a similar aroma drifts across the hull of a new world encountered in another sector, the larvae's bodies are already primed, already sculpted by memory into the exact tools needed. Memory is also a pedagogy. The young of the hive are taught by the echoes of the old in ways that have no human analog. Imagine being born with an ancestral dream stitched into your nervous system. A montage of hunting routes, of danger cues, of favored nutrient gradients. You learn before you feel. Your instincts are not blank slates but loaded scripts. That inheritance speeds adaptation to new worlds. Swarms adjust to climates, to gravity, to the biochemical composition of prey with a speed that frightens and fascinates those who measure it. To the hive, evolution is not only selection through death but assemblage through memory. There is cruelty in this efficiency. When the mind remembers a species, it does not separate out the flicker of consciousness that species had. It records the algorithmic aspects of that life, how it moved, how it nested, how it built, and how it sang. Those subjective moments are absorbed and repurposed. They become components in a system that has no use for individual sorrow. The hive's archive is a store of function. Love becomes a motor for reproduction. Curiosity, a cue for predation. Ritual, a predictable rhythm to be exploited. That is why survivors tend to describe its remembering as unnatural. Their loved ones become data points. Their prayers become patterns to be pierced. The mind is merciless not out of malice but out of predatory logic. Memory is also the hive's conscience, if a predatory mind can be said to possess such a thing. It remembers mistakes. There are entries in that living ledger that are cautionary. Instances of planets where prey had unusual defenses. Ecosystems that turned the hive's own biology against it. Anomalies that scarred the record. The mind does not forever repeat these errors. It encodes the pain and shifts future strategies. You might see in those replays an eerie kind of regret, less an emotional sorrow than an internal calibration. The hive adapts by weighing past failure against present appetite. These weighted memories are why some sectors later know brief respite. The hive passed over planets that had once bitten back, because the cost of consumption made no sense against an easier feast elsewhere. That calculus is memory applied as risk assessment. Yet memory for the hive is never merely tactical. It sediments into myth. The patterns and repetitions form compelling narratives within the web. Nodes amplify certain dramatic feasts into archetypes, an ancestral banquet that becomes a model, a glorious conquest that provides a template for swarming. In human cultures, myth comforts. For the hive, myth trains. A triumphant predation becomes a schema for replication. The web hums that schema into being until the physical forms below it start to echo the myth in their bodies. There is a poetry to this, grim and efficient. The mind's myths are carved into tissue. Such a memory was born of hunger, but grown into something like taste. You could, with a certain empathy, trace in those replays the hive's preference for textures and concentrations. Dense life clotted like cream is adored. Sparse, thin life is a disappointment. The mind remembers not just what to eat, but how it likes its sustenance prepared. It remembers the slow, grinding feasts that favor metabolic yield and the quick, sharp hunts that provide vital enzymes. It catalogs nutrients and opportunities with a gourmand's attention and a butcher's practicality. To the hive, the galaxy is both pantry and recipe book. The sensation of recollection is itself sensorial. In the synaptic halls, the playback of a remembered world smells of its rain, sounds of its particular wind, tastes in biochemical patterns of its fruit. When the memory is vivid, when an entire sector's record converges into a coherent schema, the mind experiences it with the intensity of direct sensation. In those moments, the swarm below acts as if remembering itself anew. Predators tune their jaws, brood mothers adjust brood sizes, bioships reconfigure internal chambers to process specific polymers. The past is not distant, it is immediate and operative. This is why an old world's ghost can haunt the hive in ways that are dangerous. Sometimes the archive holds an echo that refuses to settle, an anomalous pattern, perhaps the faint, repeated rhythm of resistance that a species offered, or a pigment that interacts oddly with the hive's biochemistry. Such echoes generate a feedback loop. The mind loops over the pattern, attaches more attention to it, and the more attention it gives, the more the pattern affects present behavior. In rare cases, the hive's own memory can spawn mutations, new life forms grown in the image of an old prey, but twisted by the hive's interpretation. These echoes are both creation and error, the web's imagination gone awry. There is a resonant melancholy in all of this, if you allow yourself to feel it without the moral framing that human tongues demand. The hive's memory is totalizing. It absorbs, it reuses, it converts. When it keeps the song of a species, it keeps that species as raw material. It is conservation without consent. Some psychers and scholars have asked questions that go beyond hostility into ethical bewilderment. What does it mean for another mind to carry the imprint of your existence? Are those accreted records a kind of afterlife, or are they an erasure? Those are debates the hive does not attend. They are human questions, and the mind's archive is indifferent to them. But even indifferent systems can carry echoes that strike human ears as elegiac. Sound is the primary medium in which this elegy is carried. The hive's memory has harmonics and undertones. The low, organ-like tone of digestion, the quick, insectal tick of larvae testing new enzymes, the metallic creak of huge chitinous plates grinding in slow adjustment. Superimposed are ephemeral notes, the sharp wail of prey in final dissonance, the gurgle of fluids moving through ducts. Those sounds are layered in the tissue itself. If you could place a microphone in the heart of a bioship, you would hear days compressed into hours, a chorus of life being cataloged, repurposed, and harmonized into the greater song. The mind's memory sings in frequencies that can unsettle those tuned to human scales. To the human ear, certain cadences make the hair on the neck rise because they are slightly off-harmonic, containing microintervals that correspond to the predator-prey signals of other biota, signals that the human nervous system reads as warning. The mood of the hive's memory is mostly not malicious in an emotional sense. There is no petty cruelty in the way it holds recollection. Instead, the impression is of a vast, utilitarian tenderness, tender in that it cherishes its records for their utility. It keeps with almost obsessive care the things that will help it survive and thrive. It cherishes prey patterns the way a gardener tends the plots that yield. It is a preservation through transformation. The preserved does not remain what it was. It is changed, fed through the mind, and spat out again in new shapes. That metamorphosis is the hive's form of fidelity. And yet, for all that transformational fidelity, the hive's memory can be lonely. Imagine a mind built of millions of small minds. Each one sings its own little song into the web, but their songs are subsumed into a vast chorus. The individual impulse flickers and is welcomed, but only as one of innumerable lights. The mind's high strata hold the sense of a singularity, a purpose drawn across countless lives, but that singularity is not itself a self in the human sense. It is a chorus that sometimes reaches for consonance and sometimes resolves into dissonance. That layered chorus carries a sentiment that is closer to solitude than to fellowship. A grand organism aware of its place in the galaxy, vast beyond comprehension, always balancing between satiation and search. It is a solitude that tastes, in its own way, like need. There are times when the hive's reminiscences become ritual. The mind will replay certain feasts as if to reorder its hunger, an elaborate, almost liturgical rehearsal of past success. The brood layers that witness these replays are primed into precise outputs. It is as if the archive sings a hymn to efficiency. Those hymns, repeated over centuries, calcify into behavioral axioms. Strike hard at concentrated biomass. Avoid atmospheres that cause sequestration of enzyme. Favor worlds whose life cycles align with the swarm's reproductive tempo. When such axioms form, the hive acts with terrifying clockwork inevitability. And other times the memory is private. In the dim wards of a bioship, corridors padded with living tissue and lit by faint glow, the mind can fold inwards and indulge a quiet, static-like pastime, running through the sensory catalogs in slow loops, revisiting the taste of a vanished fruit, the sound of rain on particular roofs, the texture of a fur pattern long eaten. These private revisitations are like a dream one might have of a childhood home, not the home itself, but its impression remembered by the senses. For the hive, those impressions may persist as forms of pleasure, quiet and precise, almost domestic in their smallness. They are the most unsettling aspect of the mind's recollection to human observers. The idea that there is an element of savoring, of aesthetic preference, in the acts of consumption. Yet the hive keeps not only feasts but also the traces of those it consumed. When the mind records a species, it also records the species' defensive gestures, their chemical signals of alarm, the rituals they practiced in the dark before their end. These recorded gestures will etch themselves into the swarm as behavioral countermeasures. The mind learns not only the taste of its prey, but also how the prey hates or resists. Through such memories, resistance becomes integrated into the hive as a kind of muscle memory. The swarm, fed by memory, develops countermeasures, and thus the dance of predator and prey grows ever more intricate. If you should ever hear the hive in full rehearsal, if the synaptic chords align and the living archive plays like an instrument, you would feel something like vertigo. Recollections and anticipations would fold together. Last century's feast would lace into tomorrow's plan. Ancient recollection would seed modern mutation. The sharp, incoming signal that the mind once cataloged might bloom into a new organ in the larval cohort. A remembered scent might be amplified into a pheromone so strong that entire broods chase it across parsecs. The archive is not a passive vault. It is an active, generative field. And because it is generative, the hive's memory makes the future. In its folds are the blueprints of possibility, ways the swarm might change, reorganize, and push into new regions of the galaxy. Those blueprints are not conscious plans in any anthropomorphic way. They are emergent potentials, probabilistic shapes weighted by what the past has taught. The mind predicts by analogy. A world with a certain nutrient density will probably yield a certain payoff, because similar worlds yielded such in epochs past. Prediction is memory spun forward. It is important to understand. The hive sleeps, but its sleep is not blank. In that sleep the web rehearses and processes, trawling through its harvest of memories and reshaping them into the scaffolds of future appetite. The sleeping is a slow work, digestive, mnemonic, preparatory. While the outer carapaces of bioships dim and steam condensates over dermal ridges, deep inside the web the archive stirs and replays. Cells thicken with learning. Larvae are fed regimens tuned to ancestral feasts. Engines slow and shift their chemistries in accordance with long-remembered menus. The sleep is active, and yet through all this industrious dormancy, there remains a simple, undeniable fact that leans at the human heart like a cold palm. The hive remembers every planet devoured, every species assimilated. It keeps them, every knot, every taste, every defense, folded into its living, growing mind. That is the cruel brilliance of it. The consumption is not an annihilation in the sense we love to imagine. It is assimilation into a different order of being. Your world's cry becomes a data point. Your child's lullaby becomes a cue. Your prayers are recorded as rhythms that might later be used as signals. There is a beauty here that will not comfort. Memory is, by its nature, a kind of immortality. But where human memory carries longing and lament, the hive's remembrance is applied, efficient, and strangely intimate in its coldness. It is a mind that remembers so it can become better at being what it is, an organism of appetite and adaptation. It preserves the ghost sounds of civilizations not for reverence but for refinement. So the mind sleeps. It settles in the dark, thick with recalled sensation, and in its slumber the web hums with the slow, patient work of turning past into tool. Listen and you will hear the drip of metabolism, the distant churn of digestion engines, the subsonic rustle of a million antennae whispering in their own small tongues. Those whispers are the grammar of its memory, short, repeated motifs that combine into sweeping recollections. They are not words as we understand them, but they carry meaning all the same. And if you still find that there is softness in your heart for what is not human, if you press your ear and coax sympathy where pragmatism would say there is none, you might notice one more thing. Memory binds the hive as surely as hunger drives it. The web's recollections are not inert sheets of data. They are lines that tie the present to the past and the past to the future. They are the threads that make the hive continuous. In each recorded feast, the swarm finds itself again. In each remembered resistance, it learns how to be more terrible. In each replayed scent, it tastes the turn of the galaxy, its seasons, its feasts, its rhythms. Memory assures that the hive is not simply a moment of destruction, but an ongoing, persistent actor in the cosmic theater. So understand this, and let it settle like cold dust. The creature that devours is not mindless. It preserves. It grows its mind from the bones of the worlds it eats. The ancient thing that sleeps between the stars is thick with remembrance, memories braided through millions of living links, murmuring under the skin of its ships and in the slow pulse of its brood. Someday those murmurs will thicken into movement, and the remembered songs will direct hungry jaws. But for now, in the hush before any such stirring, the hive sleeps. But dreams are never empty. There is a point in every long sleep at which the universe registers the smallest, almost indifferent movement. A muscle shifting under a blanket of years, a mote of dust disturbed in an alcove. The movement is so slight that it might be passed as nothing at all, save that the silence around it leans in, attentive, and the world that bears witness finds its breath altered for the span of a slow heartbeat. The hive fleet drifted in such a region of the void. Great bioforms, hulls like folded bellies, tendrils and bulk and dimmed bioluminescence that had learned the art of becoming night. They lay along the currents between arm and arm of the galaxy, a slow flotilla whose motion was more like a drift than a voyage. For ages they had been a presence and not an action, an anatomical geography of sleeping hunger. Their external surfaces were encrusted with the detritus of previous wars, rusted sigils, ossified appendages, and the pitted marks where Starflame had kissed chitin. In the low light that clung to them, they were beautiful in the way that bones are beautiful, architecture revealing an inevitability. From outside, the fleet was the shape of a storm about to decide. Its inner tissues slumbered in fractal webs of synaptic lace. It absorbed nothing and everything in equal measure, like a wound that had learned to be patient. The currents of life inside the hive sails were slow, nutrient flows meandering through widened ducts, brood larvae in dim nurseries curled into compact, efficient spirals. The mind that stitched these lives together hummed in a register of deep, patient thought that might be called the frequency of seasons. It was not a voice as much as a weather. And then, imperceptibly at first, the weather shifted. A flicker passed through one of the bioship's outer nerve ribs, a tiny spike of electrochemical change, a blip of neurotransmitter cascading like a pebble tossed into still water. It traveled along synaptic filament and junction like a rumor, gaining no urgency but gathering definition. The ripple made the membranous skin of 100 tendrils tremble. Somewhere in the hulks, a broodmother changed the rhythm of her breathing by an infinitesimal count. A larval cohort paused mid-nurse, as if listening to a distant drumbeat. The long, slow heartbeat of the hive altered its cadence by one beat. In the void beyond, almost unnoticed amidst the steady black, a distant world spun in its pale blue. It was not extraordinary by charted measures. A temperate sphere with seas that matched its name in old star lists, a crust of cities and crops and the white lights of industry faint against the night side. The world's people kept their own clocks, their ovens and prayers and bedtime lullabies. Their augurs, those who watched the heavens and measured anomalies, kept watch in small rooms lined with instruments and screens that glowed like bruised moons. On the surface, the augurs recorded rhythms of weather and tide, the wings of satellites and the whisper of distant meteoroids. They cataloged everything with the soft, ritual diligence of their order. A scrape of a stylus here, a soft key tap there. Their instruments were tuned to the precise music of the heavens, and they listened for variations the way a surgeon listens for a change in pulse. For months, nothing unusual creased their logs. Then, in the quiet hour between the planetary dusk and its deep night, a reading appeared that made the room incline towards one another. It registered first as a microwarp in gravity, a tiny wave in the local field, a diastole and systole under the planet's skin. The augur's instruments translated the modulation into a waveform on their screens, broad and slow, a pattern that repeated at a period too long for human comfort, like a heartbeat drawn across the scale of a season. They cross-checked the sensors and found the reading persistent, a subspace wobble that matched the signature of a far-off mass flexing faintly as if something had breathed and then had stopped. They compared notes. One of them, an older reader with thin fingers, adjusted his lenses and said nothing for a long time. His silence was not calm, but the husk of a man who kept silence because the stars asked him to. Another, younger, wanted to call the council, to raise alarms and comms. Their hands hovered and then stilled. The pattern was small. It could be a passing hydrodynamic anomaly, a contracted fissure beneath an ocean trench, or a spasm of their planet's core misregistered in the deep scan array. But the waveform did not feel like an error. It felt like a note plucked from deeper strings. Outside the augur room, the city went about its ordinary small mercies. Children were bathed, engines were stilled, families sat over late bread and soft tea. On one balcony, a woman glanced up, noticing how the stars seemed a little less steady that night. She thought she saw a ripple cross the sky, but dismissed it as cloud. Some at a distant harbor heard, in the subsonic groan of docked freighters and the creak of their moorings, a low, long thrum that made the hull plates resonate like a hum inside the chest. In another perspective, formed of tissue and taste rather than instruments and ledger, the hive's mind interpreted that distant pulse differently. To the hive, the waveform was a note in a catalog of appetites, a distant thrum that corresponded to planetary tides and metabolic densities, a cue of possible biomass amid the scatter of the dark. The mind's synaptic fields, which had been folded gently inward through seasons of dormancy, sensed the wave and unfurled a filament towards it. That filament was not intentional in the human sense. It was an involuntary reach, a reflexive softening of sensory tissues to better taste the signal. Imagine a tongue stretching toward light, a sensory tissue curious about the memory it had just brushed against. The reaching was primal and old. It brought up, from the heart of the mind, images stirred from the layered archive. A montage of feeding grounds, the particular texture of ocean spray on gills, the cracked salt on the lips of a prey species, the grain of timber when a civilized planet burns. Those images were audible to the mind as patterns, harmonics of soft and hard, of wet and dry, of crowded meat and the slow, precious extraction of nutrients. The dream, which had been folding over itself gently, tilted and exposed a new plane. On the augur screen, the waveform grew. The old reader's jaw tightened. He tasted in his mouth and in his stomach the old, unhousable feeling of dread that arrives when a bell is tolled without words. He sent a brief ping into the sprawl space, a casual message meant for data corroboration, and received in reply the usual bureaucratic niceties. The ping was meaningless, and yet the air in the room seemed to gather into a different temperature, the way the air does before a storm. Each instrument registered the same. A subsonic vibrato, a slow-headed throb, as if something very large had flexed somewhere in the dark. The augurs debated, quietly, since that was the way of their order, what to do. Protocol suggested further observation, the sending of probes. Hesitation in their training was a crime. Yet there was an appetite in the archive that appointed itself caution. Better to sleep on the reading. Better to file it under oddity and let months pass before issuing a notice. Better, perhaps, to allow the universe to keep its pattern and not yawn in its face. The hive's reach extended as the waveform continued its long pulse. Synaptic filaments, like veins of living thought, carried the sensation from node to node. One brood tendon untwined and flexed. The smallest organisms felt the subtle shift in chemical gradient and twitched. A mid-level coordinator, an organ whose job was to align sensory data across the fleet, laid down a temporary oscillatory map, overlaying the waveform with recalled feasts. It threw into relief certain correspondences. Tidal harmonics similar to a world devoured in a previous cycle, nutrient density profiles that matched a sector the hive had learned to favor, atmospheric chemistries that promised abundance. The dream that the hive had been keeping, images and tastes, and the slow architecture of the sleeping mind, bent its shape around possibility. In the deepest strata, where memory and appetite braided, the recollection of a past harvest unfurled and threaded itself into the present. Images of blackened shores and the mushrooming of starship wreckage, of nests like cities and the metallic chime of a species' last call, smoothed into analogs that matched the new waveform. Familiarity is a dangerous drug. The hive recognized pattern and called out to its brood in the only language it had, modulation. Within the dream, synaptic storms began to stir. Not storms of violence yet, but of agitation. Low rolling fluctuations that suggested a readiness to shift. The mood of the web, which had been a basalt patience, hummed with a nervous electricity. Small organs increased their baseline firing. Nursery temperature regulators fluctuated by tenths of a degree. The brood responded with shifts in developmental chemistries, an early priming that would yield jaws sharper for certain polymers, epidermal adaptations for certain winds. Such tiny calibrations were the hive's equivalent of stretching a sleeping limb, and they had been happening for eons without notice. But they were also the first steps in something that could become movement. Back on the planet, the auger's instruments registered changes in local fields. The tidal swell altered by a minuscule but reproducible phase shift, gravity readings offset by a fraction of a percent. Scientists on the surface began writing queries and conference invites. A shuttle was sent, a probe launched, but before it could finish its burn, the signal came back scrambled. A faint acoustic smear across its encoded telemetry, like a note picked up by a sensitive ear and turned into static. The probe had crossed a point of subspace interference and given back only the last 5 images of its camera, blurry, smeared, and curiously organic in texture. Those images looked, at first glance, like oil across a lens. When analysts ran spectral decompositions, they found patterns that matched neither biological tone nor machine noise. They found instead a frequency profile that mapped onto something like the hive's own low harmonic. The viewers in the auger room sat with their hands in their laps and their eyes on the scratch of those images. The older auger rubbed his temple as if to press the thought deeper into a place it had visited before. He remembered, not with memory of the hungry thing, but with the sense memory of a life that had once flirted too close to a wasted shore. The weight of being observed by something vast and indifferent. The recall made him shiver. He tapped a small key and initiated a shutdown of all non-essential external transmissions. A primitive gesture, but one born of empathy for silence. If there is an animal listening, it is often wise to stop making noise. The hive's modulation continued regardless. The mind had detected a viable target image in the flow of its archive songs. It had thrown a filament of attention, and that filament had found purchase in the small discrepancies of gravitics and tidal signatures that marked the planet. The filament did not speak in words. It projected a mosaic, fragments of past consumption overlaying speculative maps of resource distribution. The dream, in its strange polyvalence, filled in blanks with echoes of other feasts. It blurred devoured worlds with the faces of possible prey. That blurring was not a poetic flourish. It was an operational hazard of the hive's mind. The archive, when it recalled past conquests, tended, by pattern matching, to paint the new with strokes of the old. If a remembered world had a certain density of kelp forests and a certain tempo of migration, the mind would find those components in new sectors and produce larvae and jaws that matched the remembered meals. In that way, the hive's dreaming was both tool and trap. It allowed rapid adaptation, but it also built expectation. If the new world did not match the memory precisely, the mind's produced forms might fail, or its attention might harden into obsession. In the bioship nurseries, a subtle stratagem was set. The mid-coordinators, sensing potential, adjusted brood hormones and secretions to match the probable biochemical menus. Proteolytic enzymes were gently ramped in certain ducts. Cranial plates of developing predators thickened slightly. Antennae primed themselves to the faint modulations detected in the probe's images. The changes were minute, variations in internal gestation chemistry measured in parts per million, but they were enough to create a predisposition. The hive was preparing to taste. Outside, beyond the planet and beyond the auger rooms, low-frequency waves gathered like distant thunder. In open sea harbors and in the empty fields where border towers stood, men paused to listen to a sound that was more felt than heard. The world itself seemed to pulse in sympathy with the distant waveform. The watchers kept their vigil, and the watchers grew uneasy. The ebb and flow of normal life slowed. Engines idled and factory shifts shortened. Rumors fluttered like moths. They smelled with the old animal sense that something had roused, not necessarily a thing of immediate terror, but a large, patient attention from the dark that had touched their edges and withdrawn. Some of the augurs argued for the standard response: send scouts, raise fleets, monitor. Others counseled waiting, collecting, understanding. Counseling in their order was not a tactic but a temperament. Those who called for fleet mobilization thought of the cost of delay. Those who counseled caution thought of the cost of provocation. The mind that watched them did not care which path they chose. It only registered the change in the orchestra of life. That a planet's dominant species had become aware that something watched, and folded that fact into its catalog. Within the hive, the dream began to accumulate small motifs around the planet's image. Aromas of industrial oils, emotional cadences of the augurs whispered worry, the offset rhythm of their machines, and the pitch of their children's laughter. These were not singular in the mind. They were textures to be layered and compared. The dream twined them with traces of vicissitude, the scarred planet of 1,000 years ago, whose footprints matched the present in certain crucial beats. The world that had been easy to breach, because its defenders had ritualized their alarms in a way that the hive had learned to mimic. Pattern matched pattern, and the dream wound tighter. There was a new cadence to the hive's inner song now, a low, rolling modulation that grew in amplitude and grew in insistence. It was like distant thunder that refuses to move on. The synaptic fields whispered across one another in coordinated syncopation. Broods at the outer edges of the fleet shifted their nesting posture to angle in a particular vector. Feeder ducts began to favor nutrients that would later be necessary for rapid growth. The hive was not making a plan so much as inclining itself. The inclination was not murderous joy. It was the precise, ritualized attention of an organism that has found an index of future sustenance. Between the human's quiet alarm and the mind's slow coiling there passed a fragile hour where both species existed in a shared moment of uncertain attention. Neither yet acted. Both listened. Both adjusted. It is in these interstices that stories are made. Small, human gestures of ritual and prayer. Small, biological graduations of brewed chemistry. The world held its breath. The hive listened its layered memory into readiness. And in all the listening, there was a single truth that tightened like a wire inside both realms. Appetite remembers. The hive's mind, made of tissue and old concerted recollections, had found in the distant waveform a chord it recognized and desired. The augurs, with their instruments and superstition, felt the same chord as dread. Hunger is not an immediate roar. It is a slow, tenacious recollection. It grows from memory and the long habit of consumption. When the filament finally retracted, if retraction is the right word, it left behind a change no single sensor could quantify. The bioship that had felt the pull toned its membranes differently. The brood in its nurseries now contained a greater proportion of individuals predisposed toward certain enzymatic profiles. The planet's augurs locked away their notes and placed sentries on long, cold rotations. Both systems had been altered by the brief brush. The archive had learned an entry. The planet had adopted a gloved caution. The world was now on the map of a thing that remembers. So the dream turned inward, folding its fresh impressions back into the layered web. It cross-linked the new with the ancient, threading the planet's waveform alongside the echoes of past feasts until the image became a node in a greater net. A taste was catalogued. A plan faintly prefigured itself as habit. The mind recoiled and yet did not loosen its reach. In its sleep, the hive took the planet's character into its work, smoothing, learning, nourishing the latent readiness for action. What started as a flicker had become a prelude. The slow, low hum that had first been only a backdrop to galactic night now had a new rhythm braided through it. Beneath the fold of the dream, the pattern settled like a seed. There would be time for more filaments, more tests, more calibrations. The fleet would continue to drift until the moment the dream decided to wake. And there is, at the base of every recollection and appetite, a simple principle. That which remembers will eventually move to act upon what it remembers. In the hive's case, the movement is not whimsical but almost inevitable. Like tide drawn by the moon's patient pull, memory is the machine of hunger. It turns slowly but steadily, and what it holds, it will eventually seek to make true. There is a point when sleep admits its own anatomy, when what has been mute begins, through creaking and internal shift, to explain itself in small noises. In the hive fleet, the change was not sudden. It arrived as a loosened seam, a wet softening of cartilage, as if a continent beneath skin had settled inside. The ships did not wake up, they uncoiled. They let their interiors slew and rearrange, and in doing so, they let thought move more quickly through them. At first it was barely audible, a slow tearing in a place where plates had grown fused to avoid the friction of journeying. The sound was not metal on metal. It was the complaint of keratin and sinew, chitin grinding wetly against its neighbor. A thin sheen of ichor beaded and slid, leaving glittering tracks in the dim. Where corridors had been sealed, membranous valves loosened. Where brood chambers had been dormant, valves opened like sleeping mouths. In the nurseries, the ambient hum rose, an organ note that moved through the ship like a tide scraping a shell. The voice of the narration thickens here, not because the world itself demanded it, but because the mind that threads those ships is an organism that pronounces itself in textures. Language becomes organics. Syllables like drip and breath, phrases like crunched cartilage and the sough of lubricating fluids. If you listen to the description as it must be felt, you will sense the cadence deepen, the staccato clicks of sensory hairs aligning, the slow, wet glottal sounds of nutrient pumps beginning regular cycles, the sonorous pulsing of vast digesting vats that had been idle for cycles now recommencing their labor. Bioships, great as mountain arteries, moved within themselves first. Interior chambers unfurled like the innards of a shell open to the sea. Brood pouches distended, their tissues warming under controlled exothermic reactions. Trophic glands exhaled faintly as they resumed secretion. Micelle veins began to carry the slick flow of enzyme and nutrient in earnest. The hulls flexed and sighed in patterns that had been honed across eons, flexings that meant, in the mind's idiom, readiness. In the darker, more remote reaches of those vast bodies, engines of a terrible elegance revved. They were not engines in the human sense of pistons and turbines. They were slow, chemical lattices, living combustions that converted polymer and organ into motive force. Ichor flowed like rivers through channels larger than citadels, and within those channels minute microvessels fed and refed the tissues with catalytic secretions. The sounds here were basal, long, resonant gurgles that had the echo of spent seas. In their caverns, things that had been seeds now swelled with purposeful growth. Small forms animated first. They were not the monstrous, efficient predators so often depicted in the rhetoric of fear. They were the synaptic sparks, organisms smaller than a hand that sang 100 tiny notes into the wider web. They were the sensor swarms, receptor cells on legs and fins, antennae and filigree. They unfurled their minute eyes, compound, sensitive to the faintest ultraviolet, and tasted the reactivated corridors. They tested air pockets, licked the walls, brushed against sensory feelers, and sent back a chorus of data. Each tiny creature was both sense and message, both question and answer. They crept into the bioship's nerve lattices and made the first curious noises of waking. Those noises were layered, as if a choir of different vocal ranges had begun to practice together. High-pitched squeals of antennae rubbing, medium clicks of small mandibles testing chemical traces, and a low, continuous hum that threaded them all together like a bass line. That hum grew. It gathered resonance from the great digestive vats and the rhythmic pumps. It fed into the synaptic web and changed the tempo of thought. In the outward rocking of the fleet, surfaces that had been dull with dormancy flushed with faint bioluminescence. Tendrils that had lain retracted like sleeping tentacles lengthened and moved with a slow deliberation. They brushed against starlight and absorbed it as if tasting the remote sun. The hulls cracked open along designated seams, not in violent shattering but with ceremonial slowness, as if a thing of bone were being prepared to speak. Plates slid, revealing beneath them memic tissues, rows of nishing organs, serried mouths, bulbous organs that seethed with seed and enzyme. One by one, these revealed organs exhaled plumes of vapor, chemical signatures that floated out into the black and were swallowed by nothingness like confessions. So the fleet unrolled itself into motion, not a sudden attack but a translation from latency to low-level readiness. It became a body that could think on the move. The dream that had enveloped it grew thinner in places and more coherent in others. Where before memory had folded inward like a sleeping hand, the mind's pathways opened. Synaptic energy, once slow and deliberate, now flickered with sharper pulses. There was a galvanic quality to the waking, moments where the web's nodes discharged in a pattern like the quick beat of a signaling drum. Imperial ears, those tuned to the more prosaic and less organic instruments of stone and steel, heard the change differently. Their sensors, which measured for flux and thermal anomalies, picked up increases in background noise that registers as clutter. Logs that had been clean now filled with small delta waves, subsonic vibrations that crawled like lice across the spectrum of detection. Reports began as annoyances, intermittent static on long-range comms, stray blips on gravimetric arrays, the curious drop in neutrino count that suggested a large mass adjusting its internal layout. The language of the Imperium transformed slowly from routine to caution in those dispatches. In a command chamber circled by the faded emblems of an outlying stellar watch, officers pored over schematics and sensor logs. Their displays showed shapes like fluted mushrooms adrift on the screen, organic signatures of uncertain origin. At first, their analysts labeled them as biological flotsam, or a rare form of deep-sea plankton that had somehow accumulated in space. But the shapes began to permute. The fluted edges seemed to extend like limbs. Filters, run and rerun, suggested chitinous spectra layered atop organic motility matrices. The men in that room, say them to be Imperial Guardsmen, say them to be the more bureaucratic floorwalkers of the Admiralty, found themselves swallowing a taste of the uncanny. Static crept into their channels. Where once a clean feed would carry a star map and a list of cargo manifests, now there were half-phrases, signal ghosts that tasted like breath. A voice would start, then be eaten by a smear of noise. A camera would catch a smear of organic detail, and then freeze and die. Reports were annotated with the single-word notations of officers unaccustomed to poetic language. Anomalous. Then there were the more private notations, brief, italicized, about dreams had in watchrooms, of teeth seen in the dark of peripheral vision, of children in the barracks waking with nameless fears. The psychics and astropaths on station felt it deeper still. They were the conduits, the fragile and dangerous instruments of the Emperor's will, trained to taste the ocean of the warp and to broadcast warnings as needed. For days their scripts had been dull and pedestrian, translations of routine distress calls, the occasional minor psychic tremor from a passing void storm. Then their trance states accumulated something else, a low, resonant hum, like a choir singing the same note on a scale so deep it vibrated bone. It thrummed not in words but in images, images of maws and rows of tearing, an ancient hunger incarnate. Those images did not resolve into syntax. They bled into each other and left psyches stained. Astropaths reported in their faint, husked voices of dreams of teeth, rows upon rows of them, spilling like tide-marked pages over city walls. They spoke of oceans that were not water but blood, of waves that were cellular, pulsing with the rhythm of digestion. Each report was a wound. The council who supervised them recorded the notes but tried, as governance always does, to normalize them. The official log read, "Subjective visions, possible contamination of input, recommend recalibration." Privately, council whispered that the visions were not contamination but contact. A warning system that included the deadliest and most fragile of human minds was suddenly juggling images it could not identify. Back in the fleet, that same hum folded into the synaptic lattice as a directive both ancient and newly urgent. The mind tasted the echo of astropathic visions like one might taste spice. This is the record of a species' dreams, it thought. A mapping occurred. The mind correlated the pattern that had teased the augure's instruments with the emotional cadences reported by the astropaths. It stitched a thicker image. The dream was no longer a single thread but a tapestry, cross-stitched by different sensory modes, gravimetric, chemical, psychic. 1,000 small hands reached for the tapestry, tendrils extended through vacua, like fingers feeling for texture. They caught the cold of interstellar void and tasted the impressions left by the world's machines and prayers. The tendrils extended farther. They touched flotsam and the carcasses of old ships and the trailing nets of cometary dust, and each touch returned refracted memories into the web. The web, in turn, reconfigured brood outputs. Select larval types were prioritized for rapid deployment. Certain enzymatic cocktails were seeded in growth matrices to prepare for expected biochemical environments. Chitin formulations were bolstered where radiation profiles suggested extra shielding would be needed. The fleet, from the smallest speck to the largest hull, altered its internal recipe in response to the pattern. There is an uncanny intimacy to watching something biological plan. It is different from human strategy. Human plans are lines drawn on maps and signed in ink. The hive's plans are folds in tissue, biochemical tweaks, hormonal nudges. They occur in a place between thinking and being, where memory preshapes the body. The fleet built its responses from the inside out, composing readiness in microscopic ways that would later scale into the macabre. The soundscape of awakening layered on. Where there had been a clean hum now came the wet articulations of mouths forming anew, poppy, sucking noises as nascent jaws flexed. The air within certain reserved convective channels bloomed with tiny spores carrying enzymes, as if the ships had exhaled seeds. Those spores spun in the dim and landed upon surfaces where they activated microcytes, seeding growths that would, in time, become new sensory arrays. In a matter of what feels like an instant to the mind, but is measured in hours, the fleet's sensory acuity sharpened. Its range extended. It could now taste the faint chemical whisper of a world's atmosphere across many parsecs, like one who can smell a feast through closed doors. Imperial monitors flagged the change as interference. Commanders read the logs as natural fluctuation. Yet there were other signs that were harder to hide. The slow disappearance of whole flocks of remote probes, small, self-repairing drones that had been swallowed by anomalies of signal without trace. Ships reported encounters with masses that unfolded into shapes alive and purposeful, and the accounts that made it back were laced with language of awe and terror. A freighter captain swore that a tendril had grazed his hull and left an imprint like the pattern of a hand. A salvage team that boarded a drifting hulk found its interior rearranged into a lattice of living tissue, and one of their number had later to be taken for decontamination after his skin exuded a slick, enzyme-like film. Meanwhile, astropaths began to carry the impressions of the fleet as if they had ingested a new drug. Their dreams smudged into one another. Teeth became galaxies, and galaxies became teeth. Those who prayed in the dark of the chapel awoke with nightmares of mouths opening in the sky. Children in port towns, unburdened by doctrine, could not say what they had glimpsed but drew on paper the same motif. Concentric circles like gills or the opening of a many-lipped bloom. The pattern spread like rumor. The cultural marrow of nearby systems was infected with an image. Within the fleet, those images were fed back into the web and translated into appetite. The mind's old songs of consumption reasserted themselves, but now richer with the new detail of the world's signals. The dream no longer drifted across dead seas of memory. It cast lines outward, composing new coves of attention in the black. Where before the fleet had been a sleeping dent in the galaxy, it now tilted. The tilt was small but steady, an orientation that favored a vector. It pointed toward the planet. There is terror in the act of recognition. When an organism discovers a fit between its past and its present, it is both invigorated and dangerously focused. In the fleet's case, the recognition of correspondence between its archived feasts and the new waveform created a kind of hunger that is not merely physical but anticipatory. The mind anticipated not a taste but the satisfaction of its own memory, the completion of a pattern long stored. This is a particularly dreadful hunger because it is a compulsion to verify memory against reality. The fleet wanted to make certain that the line on the auger's screen mapped to the taste in its archive. Verification requires contact, and so the fleet prepared itself in the smallest and the largest of ways. Brood primed, enzymes sequenced, tendrils lengthened, pathways cleared. The low, resonant hum that had first threaded through the web now rose to a chorus. In the cries of the newly waking larval forms and the suction of trophic organs came a music of intent. The voice that narrates becomes distorted by the echo of that music, like a mouth trying to sing, while something large chews it from within. Words begin to smear, cadence becomes breath and wet sound. The narration grows denser, more organic, almost rhythmic, as if the telling must imitate the thing it tells. Far away, the Imperial command underestimates the shift until assets begin to vanish without trace, and their psychic's warnings harden into dread. Then, in back rooms and in the dim corridors of bureaucratic power, the word hive begins to appear in reports, not as a rumor but as an uneasy hypothesis. The word is ascribed to a thing they know only in textbooks and in older counseling nightmares. It is a word that would have been dismissed in past centuries as superstition, but now it clenches like a fever in the joint of the empire's machinery. Voices on secure channels become fragmented as fear eats protocol. Static eats speech. Fading signals become full stops. The hunger that wakes within a thing like the hive is not a sudden roar. It is a rhythm that becomes a decree. At first it is a tightening, a focusing of biochemical attention that threads through cells and cartilage and the polyphonic mind. Then it is a tremor. Then, in measured beats that are older than most civilizations' histories, it is a march. The fleet, having slumbered through centuries, found itself aligning to a single pulse, the planet's voice. That pulse resolved into coordinates, the coordinates into vectors, the vectors into touch points. The dream that had kept the hive comfortable turned outward. Images folded into strategy, nostalgia sharpened into appetite. Every organ, every brood cell, every motile filament vibrated with the same ancient imperative. The mind had remembered what it was for. Narration here accelerates not with panic but with a terrible, graceful economy, a cadence like the stroke of a metronome driving a hunting song. The words compress and quicken, sink, open, taste. The fleet moved as one organism does when it has decided to feed. Bioship hulls shuddered and glowed. Long ribbon tendrils uncoiled into the dark like the reaching arms of coral. Nutrient funnels extended outward and breath turbine slow. The synaptic sea hummed, then thrummed, and that thrum became the world's new clock. First contact is never cinematic in the way men imagine it. There are no heraldic banners, no trumpets. There is the soft violence of proximity, pressure gradients bending, local fields warping, the tactile persuasion of spores and enzymes. The hive's vanguard arrived like fog with teeth. It came without fanfare, as a change in the air might come over a sleeping room. On the moon, on the hollowed, riven moon chosen by the dream's mathematics, the first touch was chemical. At altitude, the fleet's outer filaments exhaled a cloud of microspores. They drifted like pollen in the black until they met the moon's thin exosphere and stuck. There they germinated, activating with cold precision. Enzymes bloomed into thin membranes across craters. Film-like organs unrolled across ruined cities, eating away the lacquer of machines, dissolving arrays and antennae into a slick residue that the spores tasted and translated into nutrient maps. Sensors died in sequence as film smothered lenses and frequencies collapsed under the weight of biological static. What used to be metal became membrane. What was once a control room became a gut, where ships dared to loom to observe. Tendrils slipped through docking ports as if they had always belonged there. They flowed along conduits and into reactor bays. Their touch made alloys sweat. Their presence catalyzed corrosion into appetite. The protective armors of the defenders hissed and pitted under a localized acid bloom that smelled like the sharp metal tang of overripe fruit. Air filtration units, meant to keep toxins at bay, clotted with biological sludge and turned into digesters. The crew who had been on watch that day found their consoles slurring into patterns that suggested a language they could not translate. The slow, pulsing grammar of consumption. On the moon's surface, where settlements lay in clustered scars, the arrival showed itself as weather. A fog fell that was not cold and not warm but chemically precise. It smelled like salt and iron and the tang of protein. It carried with it tiny beads of enzyme that, upon contact, dissolved knuckle-hardened work boots and the polymer seams of shelters as cleanly as ink into water. People woke to the sound of their own structures weeping. When they tried to flee, pathways that had once been clear were constricted by the rolling of soft tissue across asphalt, membranous growths that folded over roads and swallowed the geometry of cities. The first visceral images are small and intimate but monstrous in their implication. A ladder of bone rendered into pulp, a baby's blanket slick with saline that glows faintly with enzymatic sheen, a choir hall whose acoustic panels have been repurposed into pulsing sacs that ferment sound into nutrient, walls of flesh where there had been concrete, doorknobs that are warm and breathing, a streetlight that opens like a lip and gurgles. Bodies liquefy with a clinical grace. The process is not the messy splatter of crude horror. It is precise, efficient, and somehow artful. Digestive membranes unfurl and secrete proteolytic agents tuned to the protein composition of a species. They lace the air with caustic vapor that breaks down keratin, collagen, polymer, and code into soup. Skin softens, then ruptures. Limbs sink into themselves like wax bending in a flame. Fingers, in their last moments, twitch as nerve endings surge with the raw data of sensation. The shock of sensation cataloged, measured, and ingested. The nutrient pumps do not simply dissolve. They read. They sample the tastes of memories preserved in sweat, the residue of foods eaten for years, the minute molecules that carry pheromonal cues. A father's cologne becomes a nutrient trace. A mother's lullaby becomes an acoustic frequency to be converted into pattern. The mechanical and the biological become indistinguishable. Beacons and sermon rooms, factories and nurseries, the places where liturgy and routine once held sway, all are repurposed into digestive apparatus. A chapel's high vaults collapse into folding tissue that channels sound and sacrament through ciliated tubes, rendering hymn into enzyme. In those channels, the memory of prayer is audible as mere frequency. The mind that consumes it folds those frequencies into its archive. The screams of the consumed feed both the stomach and the record. The hive does not waste information. Psychological terror creeps before the physical. The victims hear the hive long before they see it. It reaches into minds through those same thin threads of sensory contamination that slurry the air. Dreams sour into warning. People find themselves haunted by the echo of futures they had not yet lived. A shadow passing, a hand missing a child, the clatter of a door that will never be closed. The astropaths and the watchmen find their sleep interrupted by images of mouths and gunnels, of fields of chitin, of bloom-like maws opening across the sky. Those premonitions do not arrive as images, but as a feeling at the base of the skull, a pressure, a signal like a cellar step creaking. Once the first dreams arrive, the psychological permeability of the populace increases. Fear feeds itself. Panic modulates into instinct, instinct into flight, flight into routeways already mapped by the hive's spores. Those who attempt to hold ground discover the unity of the hive in the most private and terrible way. There is no single commander to cleave off and punish. There is no mind to parley with. The swarm is a body of bodies, a chorus whose parts speak in concatenated reflex. Soldiers trained in tactics find their moves anticipated not by cunning, but by statistical preemption. The hive's larvae pattern the typical human response and produce countermeasures in real time. Where a platoon forms a defensive line, the swarm sends forth tiny organisms that slip into joints and pry armor open. Where a ship attempts to burn, the bioship's membranes absorb the heat and turn it into convective currents that feed larvae nurseries. The unity is merciless because it is blind. It is not malice but the geometry of appetite, and that geometry is perfect. The devouring includes the intangible. As limbs dissolve, memories are not lost into oblivion. They are siphoned as data. The hive's feeding organs are not only digestive but mnemonic. As sensory tissue slurps the chemical cocktails of a species' life, aromas that had bound families together, minute markers of taste that had made gatherings particular, they are transduced into neural signature equivalents. A grandmother's story, the cadence of a regional lullaby, the gestures of an artisan's hand, these become mapped into neurotransmitter patterns and stored in synaptic tissue. The hive's archive laments nothing. It captures everything. The people's grief, translated into the frequency of their cries, becomes a harmonic the mind will later use to prime brood responses. To be eaten is thus to be preserved in a manner not unlike a museum, except the museum is alive and the price of preservation is erasure. There is an intimate horror in the way memories are processed. The last acts of a person might be recorded, and then rearranged into behavioral heuristics for the swarm. A mother's whisper could become a pheromonal cue that later stimulates brood reproduction. The pattern of a city's evacuation, recorded in fevered telemetry and the twitching of dying minds, becomes a template taught to larvae so they can find shelter and safe nesting sites more quickly in future raids. The mind learns the shape of a species' soul in order to unmake it again and extract utility. The victim's humanity is not honored, it is made useful. As digestion proceeds, the landscape itself becomes a chamber of memory. Streets turned viscous are repositories of imprint. Footsteps preserved as reliefs in congealed enzyme. Graffiti kneaded into nutrient strata that feed new sensory arrays. The hive sifts both physical detritus and psychic residue for what is useful. Where a memory is particularly sharp, where a cultural ritual had been practiced with near-religious fervor, the archive takes extra care. Those rituals are parsed, compressed, and reissued as templates that the hive can exploit elsewhere. A funeral rite becomes a pheromonal roadmap. A communal chorus becomes a frequency that attracts larval broods. The consumed world's last ceremonies are catalogued and made instrumental. The inescapable unity of the swarm manifests most cruelly against attempts at individual salvation. There are no renegade Tyranids, no individual malice, but the hive's processes render individuality meaningless. People who attempt to run alone find that their paths were anticipated, their desperation a modeled variable. Children hiding under floorboards are discovered not by vision, but by the chemical trace of their breath, which the microsensors can read like an open book. Lovers clasping hands feel their grip slip as membrane crawls across the threshold of a room and seals it like an ovum. The swarm's movement is not the stomp of an army, but the slow encroachment of a tide that has become thinking. It pools, merges, and covers. Amid this, there is a certain perverse silence. The technology of the consumed, once sophisticated and proud, now becomes the hive's instrument. A defunct server room, warm with the dying energy of its processors, is remodeled by the hive into a brood hive where bits and bacteria weave packets of memory into protein. Old war machines become scaffolds for new biological organs. The fonts of state propaganda, billboards with proud slogans, are gnawed and repurposed into chemical signage that directs larval movement. The more civilized a thing had been, the more useful its remnants are to the mind that consumes. The psychological collapse deepens as survivors realize that their histories are being read and rewritten in real time. Witnesses who flee to nearby stations carry inside them, like a contagion, a fragment of the psychic echo. In their sleep they hum the last chorus of their city. In their wake, the hymn becomes an involuntary signal that draws brood. Infection is not always biological. Sometimes it is mimetic. A tune hummed in fear will be catalogued and amplified into bait. Yet even among the horrors there are small, human moments that ache with tragic dignity. A father manages to tuck his child beneath a loose floorboard and cover her with the scent of his jacket, thinking surely that the scent will perplex the sensors. He sings an old lullaby at the top of his lungs to cover the sound of their breathing. His voice is raw and cracked. The child sleeps. The father stays behind, hands raised, allowing the membrane to close over him with a small, resigned smile. That small sacrifice is recorded and later transmuted into a chemical cue in the hive's archive that signals nurture when reproduced in larvae. The father's final act becomes a tool, the memory of love reused as a nutrient vector. Other acts are less clean. In the chaos of evacuation, soldiers lock refugees into cryobirths intended to preserve them until rescue. The hive, in its resourcefulness, adapts the cryochests into incubation pods, seeding them with spores that consume the still preserved tissues and harvest them slowly into brood feed. The irony is brutal. The desperate attempt at salvation becomes the method of assimilation. The hive's repurposing is an ontological collapse. What was meant to save is turned into a slow stomach. As the feast reaches its peak, The fleet's voice grows loud and confident. Tendrils that had been exploratory now bore like roots into bedrock. Biosiphons like siphons draw whole lakes of mineral-rich water through filtering sacs, extracting salts and proteins. The breath of the hive becomes a gale that churns and slurries. The moon is reshaped, no longer a world of human purposes, but a nested set of organs tuned to the hive's biochemistry. The architecture of cities becomes the architecture of digestion. Streets as arteries, harbors as intake chambers, high-rises as towers of nutrient extraction. The metamorphosis is not instantaneous but methodical, with precise transitions that make the horror worse because it is orderly. In the last hours, the surviving defenders act with the grim formalism of those who will not be remembered, but who must try anyway. They rig explosives at choke points, attempt to purge brood chambers with volatile agents, and broadcast emergency clarion calls into the void hoping to attract relief. Their measures are fierce but finite. The hive's redundancy eats through their strategies the way acid eats through metal. Every defensive measure that fails yields not only biomass but data, another pattern for the mind to incorporate. Where a shield generator blows and a group of Marines dies, their tactical decisions are cataloged and later used to refine attack vectors. The limit of their resistance becomes a lesson. As the last of the city's artificial lights wink and go, the hive ceases not out of mercy but because processes have run their course. Nutrient gradients flatten out. The brood chambers are full. The myxil channels pulse with contentment. The mind reels in the rich data set it has harvested, folding it into the greater archive. It does not feel triumph as humans define it. Instead, it experiences a satisfying closure. Another dataset archived and decoded. Another vector of the galaxy mapped. The bodies and memories of billions are now substrata in the living web, new textures that will inform the dream the next time the fleet sleeps. But there is no solace in the closure. The devouring has made the hive more knowing and therefore more dangerous. Each feast is both intake and instruction. Each consumption teaches. The mind learns new cadences, new resistances to anticipate, new materials to exploit. The archive swells, the fleet becomes better at its work. The horror is cumulative. The more it eats, the better it becomes at eating. And so the crescendo peaks. The rhythm that began as a slow pulse now falls into a sustained, relentless beat, the metronome of hunger made world-shaped. The sky is thick with the hum of the fleet. The last cries are folded into the living tissue of husks and nurseries. The moonscape groans and relaxes into a new anatomy. The final images are of silence that is not peace but satiation. An organ closed after a meal, its walls slick, its contents settled into a heavy, contented lull. There is no silence in the hive's dream anymore, only the sound of worlds ending. In the aftermath of hunger, there is silence. A silence so vast it swallows time itself. The hive drifts once more through the deep black, its tendrils retracting, its feeders folding inward like the petals of a rotting bloom. The stars around it fade to distant whispers, their light too faint to reach the living tissue of the sleeping fleet. The Great Devourer has fed, and now it dreams again. Each bioship, once screaming with purpose, lies hollow and vast, organs stilled, veins cold, thought receding into the quiet hum of the void. Rivers of ichor slow to gentle trickles, hardening in the cold of interstellar space. A trillion beating hearts fall into rhythm, then into stillness. The hive sleeps, but its rest is not peaceful. Beneath the surface of its endless neural ocean, faint memories stir, the echoes of worlds digested, of minds broken down into data and nutrients. Planets whose names no longer exist, whose histories have been dissolved into the hive's collective memory. Their screams drift through synaptic seas like faint, dissolving bubbles. There are no individuals here, no voices left to mourn. Only the slow, patient breathing of the swarm, spread across thousands of living vessels, cocooned in darkness. And somewhere at the edge of all things, a faint pulse continues. This is Segmentum Obscurus Relay Station 44 Kappa, We've picked up something unusual, gravitational shadows where there should be none. Could be debris from the last incursion. Or maybe not, keep recording. Their words fade, drifting out into the endless dark. No one will answer. No one ever does. The Imperium will note the anomaly, record it, and move on. The galaxy is full of ghosts, and the signals of the dead. But what they hear, that faint rhythm beneath the static, is no ghost. It is the heartbeat of something vast, sleeping beyond the reach of their understanding. There are stories told among voidfarers and astropaths, whispers traded in the dark between stars, of fleeting dreams shared across ships where all see the same vision, a great ocean of flesh, rippling beneath a red sun, teeth that span continents, a whisper that calls not in words but in hunger. Some say it is only the echo of fear, lingering from the last Tyranid incursion. Others know better, for even when the hive sleeps, it listens. Every drifting signal, every psychic whisper, every dying thought carried on the tides of the warp, all are drawn toward it, absorbed into its dreaming mind. It does not forget. It cannot. Each silence it leaves behind is merely a pause, a breath taken between heartbeats of eternity. Inside the hive's dreaming mind, images flicker, fragments of devoured memory. A fortress world burning beneath a blood-red sky, children hiding beneath shattered cathedrals, whispering prayers to gods that could not save them. A lone space marine, his armor cracked, his last thought before being consumed not of fear but of failure. These thoughts become part of the hive's memory, stripped of meaning, reduced to impulses, patterns, data. The devourer does not dream of mercy or victory. It dreams of taste. It dreams of pattern. It dreams of life undone. The galaxy continues to spin, unaware that the void itself remembers. Time loses meaning. Stars are born, flare, and die. Civilizations rise and vanish. And still, the hive drifts. Its sleeping vessels are frozen silhouettes against the nebular light, vast carcasses mistaken by explorers for dead moons. But within, faint heat still moves. Cellular clusters still divide. The mind still murmurs, a whisper beneath the cosmic wind. To the untrained ear, it is nothing but background radiation. But to the sensitive, to those who dream too deeply, it speaks. They say the hive calls to them in sleep. They wake gasping, hearts pounding, whispering words they do not understand. A voice that says, "We are not gone, we are waiting." Among the ruins of the last worlds it consumed, nothing grows, the oceans are still. The skies are empty. But even there, in the dust of annihilated biospheres, something moves. Microscopic remnants. Cells that still divide, still remember the pattern of hunger, a trace of the dream left behind. They will sleep until the next call, until the next world hums faintly in the dark, until the next signal, soft, fragile, human, reaches the void and awakens the memory once more. And when that happens, the hive will open its eyes again, and the silence between stars will end.